This is Annie Scogan, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Head Over Heels Pageant Talk, and I want to thank you for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Baxter Colburn, host of the Verse of the Day podcast on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Verse of the Day. In Verse of the Day, we talk about practical examples on how each verse in the Bible can be applied to our daily lives and draw us a little bit closer to all that God has to offer. A new show comes out every single day, so don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Verse of the Day podcast. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey everyone, welcome to Beauties and Headcanons, where we're nerdy, and you probably are too. This is Emily, and I'm here today with Elisabeth, and we're here to talk nerdy to you.
And today's topic is actually one of my favorite video game franchises, which is The Elder Scrolls. And while I'm sure probably most of our audience has at least heard of Skyrim, and maybe, fingers crossed, Oblivion and Morrowind, the franchise actually stretches back much further than that, so we're going to be going over some previous games, along with some of their plot lines. And hopefully if you haven't played any of the games by now, this will motivate you to pick them up and give them a try, because they're a lot of fun. And I've made sure to not include any spoilers. It's just enough information to give an overview and pique your interest.
Sounds awesome.
Oh yeah, so The Elder Scrolls actually has a lot of lore and backstory to it, and I'm hoping in future episodes we can kind of delve into that. But I'm just going to kind of go over some more basic information for now. And that is, for now, the Elder Scrolls series are set on a planet called Nirn, specifically in one or sometimes more of the countries on the continent of Tamriel. There are various races that inhabit the continent, along with a few extinct races that are mentioned or hinted at here or there. And as of the game Morrowind, you can play as any of the non-extinct races. And all of the races have their own unique backstory, as well as different racial abilities and stats that are better suited for different types of playstyles depending on what you want to do with them.
That's awesome.
Oh yeah, and before we delve into the games, I actually wanted to go to kind of talk about the races and where they come from just a little bit, just so, you know, for our listeners out there who might not know much about the Elder Scrolls or who might not have played before, you know, this might give you a little bit of an idea of, you know, what race to go for and, you know, how to play in the game. So there are 3 different types of races. There's human, elves, and then there's beast races. And there are 4 different human races. They're the Nords. They are from Skyrim. They're actually originally from the continent of Atmora, but they have a natural frost resistance, and they typically make really good warrior characters, whether that's like a barbarian kind of character or a sword and board. You know, they're just pretty good melee. They don't really do a whole lot of magic in that regard.
All right, yeah. So there's like a general hardy character kind of.
Yeah, pretty good basic character. I would say they don't really specialize too much unless it's like, you know, like a warrior kind of thing. So, you know, they're a pretty good standard race to go with if you just do a standard fighter. Now next are the Red Guards. They're from Hammerfell. They are originally from the continent of Yokuda, which was actually lost and fell into the sea. They are known for being the most naturally talented warriors in Tamriel, so they're another really strong choice for a warrior character, maybe one who specializes a little bit more in their sword play or axes or something like that.
All right, cool. And so now all of these different races, they'll have slightly different appearances to them too, so, you know, visually.
Yeah, so the Nords are usually described as like fair-skinned, usually light-haired, you know, typical what you would think of as like a Viking kind of a look. Red Guards have dark skin. They're, you know, obviously they hail from Hammerfell, which is a desert country, so they, you know, wear, you know, like turbans a lot of the time and stuff like that. The Imperials are from the central province of Cyrodiil. They're actually descended from the Needs and Cyranords. They were originally subjugated by a race of elves called the Aelids until Saint Alessia led a rebellion against them that ended up actually wiping out the Aelid race. They're pretty shrewd diplomats, but they also make pretty good soldiers, and they're a solid choice for a typical warrior archetype. And they kind of draw their physical appearance kind of from Italians, that kind of area of the Mediterranean.
Okay. So sounds like a lot of warriors so far, which is okay.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, the humans, most of the humans are really more warrior-based, except when you get to the Bretons, which are the last human race. They are from High Rock, and they descended from the Needs, who actually mated with elves. So because of that, they actually possess innate magical abilities that kind of predispose them to magical characters. So you could do something like a spell sword, you could do a battle mage, or you can just do a straight up pure mage with them. They're really more suited for something that's going to use some type of magic to kind of, take advantage of that innate magical ability.
That is pretty cool, because then they've got, it's almost like they're descended from half-elves then, right? Because they were humans that mated with elves, making kind of like a half-elf race in a way?
In a way, yeah. I mean, appearance-wise, they look like just plain humans, and I believe the influence of their culture kind of came from the area of France. So that's kind of like the physical appearance that they have, kind of fairer skin and everything like that. But they definitely do have that innate magical ability that's actually come from being descended from elves. So yeah, they're kind of a little bit different when it comes to the human races.
Nice.
And after that, we have 4 elf races. There's the Altmer, or also known as the High Elves. They're based in Somerset Isle, and they're thought to be the most direct, unaltered descendants of the original Aldmer elves that, kind of like the original basis for all of the different elf races. They're kind of seen as kind of snobbish by most of the races of Tamriel because they think of themselves as superior to most of the races of Tamriel just because they're the oldest. And so they're not always seen in the best light. But they do have a very strong innate magical ability that make them probably one of the best choices for mage characters.
All right. And so mage is just purely magic as far as any kind of fighting or anything goes. Whatever other types of characters you wanted to do, then they wouldn't necessarily use weapons, though.
Not unless they're a spell sword or a battle mage. The community does get a little nitpicky in the classification. A pure mage is a mage that uses only magic, and they wear robes. So they don't wear any armor, they don't carry any weapons, they only use magic and robes. A battle mage is a mage that actually wears armor, but they still don't use any weapons. They only use magic, whether that's a destruction magic like fire or ice, or if they use conjuration to conjure creatures to fight for them, or if they conjure weapons to fight with, they're still considered battle mages, as long as they wear armor. And then spell swords are mages who they'll wear armor, and they'll also use one physical weapon in one hand, and then they'll use a spell in another hand. So a spell sword might have an actual sword, like a physical sword in their one hand, or they might use a mace or an axe or, whatever they want to use. But they'll have a physical weapon in one hand, and then they'll have a spell equipped in their other hand.
Gotcha. So a spell sword does like a one-handed melee weapon usually, and then spell. Okay.
Yep. So, and the community does kind of get a little nitpicky when it comes to those differences. So that's
good to know.
And then next up, we have the Dunmer, or the Dark Elves, and they are from Morrowind. They actually used to be Chimer, and they used to have golden skin, kind of similar to Altmer. However, the Daedric Prince Azura actually changed their appearance, so their skin is more like this ashy gray-blue color, and their eyes are red. And instead of following the divines like a lot of other races, they actually worship a pantheon of 3 Daedric princes, Azura, Mephala, and Boethia. They have a natural fire resistance, and they're well balanced in regards to magic versus melee skills. So As far as a type of character, probably good to exploit both and go with like a battle mage or a spell sword, or you could just do a straight up warrior and, they can just do whatever.
Nice. That is pretty cool. Interesting that their appearance was actually changed physically as part of the lore. A little tidbit. I like tidbits.
Oh yeah, there's actually a whole long backstory behind, how and why they were changed. And hopefully maybe one day I'll get into that, because Dunmer are probably one of my favorite races because of their long storied kind of semi-complicated history. And so yeah, that's kind of part of why I really like them. And another part is that they're just very versatile. They can be a warrior, or they can, be a mage. They can just, do kind of whatever, and they aren't hindered in any way. After the Dunmer, there's the Bosmer, or the Wood Elves. They're located in Valenwood, and they're descended from the Aldmer, who were able to adapt to and survive the wilds of Valenwood. Most are exclusively carnivores due to the Green Pact that they made, which states that they cannot harm any living plant. They make excellent archers, so if a sneak archer is your kind of thing, Bosmer definitely comes highly recommended.
And that's totally my character right now in Skyrim. Is a sneak archer, but is a red guard.
And that is the great thing about Skyrim as opposed to other games, is Skyrim is a little bit more loose in what you can do with your character. Other games, sure, you could take an Altmer and you can make them into a warrior, but you would be a little bit more disadvantaged if you did that, as opposed to if you used a race that is a little bit more better suited for being a warrior. So that is the great thing about Skyrim, that, you can kind of just play around and be whatever, and you aren't too hindered or, too encouraged to go in a particular path, depending on what race you go with.
Yeah, that is a good thing. I also thought it's interesting that they are exclusively carnivores, the Bosmer, because typically in traditional, widespread lore about elves is that they're vegetarian. So that's really interesting that they, they have a pact to not harm any living plant.
Yeah, and it's actually because of the different plants and wildlife in Valenwood. It's a pretty wild place, and when they initially inhabited it, they had to do a lot to adapt to it, and there's a lot of plant life that is sentient or semi-sentient, and so because of that, they made that pact so that they wouldn't harm any of the sentient or semi-sentient plant life in Valenwood.
Oh, that is pretty cool though. I mean, because how else would you know whether or not something's sentient? And then you're like, oh, I'm accidentally eating this thing that can think for itself and stuff. Oops.
Yeah.
So, but then they go ahead and kill the animals. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, and the Bosmer outside of Valenwood aren't all strictly carnivores. They won't all hold to that since they aren't in Valenwood. But really, most of the Bosmer in Valenwood will hold to the Green Pact.
Makes sense.
And then the last elven race is actually Orsimer. They're better known as orcs. They're located in Orsinium and several different strongholds. Now, they were actually created when the Daedric Prince Boethia defeated the Aldmeri god Trinimek, and then he was transformed into the Daedric Prince Malakath, and then his followers were obviously transformed along with him. So, a couple of different races transforming because of, the actions of different deities here. Now, Orsinium itself, you won't really see it on a map. But it's in the mountainous region between High Rock and Skyrim, and it's been sacked and rebuilt multiple times. But they also inhabit different strongholds. There's 4 different strongholds in Skyrim, actually, and their culture is very warrior-driven, which makes them another solid choice for a warrior build. A pretty interesting thing about them, actually, is that as far as lifespan, they could live as long as, say, their other elf races, which can, usually push around 200 years or so. But they choose not to, and they typically will only live about the lifespan of a typical human, because they believe it's a dishonor to live to be old and feeble, and to the point where they would have to be taken care of by somebody. They believe it's best to, just go ahead and die in battle, or, go out and fight and die and be taken out that way, rather than just wait around and die and, just be old and feeble, and, your family has to take care of you and everything like that.
That actually reminds me a lot of the Klingon from Star Trek.
Yeah. That is a pretty good comparison.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, yeah, they're honor bound, and they they have a high value of honor in battle, and it makes sense logically why they would not want to wait around until they're wait around to die, basically.
Yeah, it's just kind of a part of their culture, and it's kind of a part of how Malakath is, and when he was transformed from Trinimax. So it's all very interconnected with the lore, and hopefully maybe one day I can get into that because I just think it's really, really interesting. But it's just something that's just built into their culture. Even though they can have these long lifespans, they actively choose not to. Yeah. And then moving on, the last two races are actually the beast races, and the first is probably one of my favorite races. It's actually the very first race that I used when I created my very first character playing my very first Elder Scrolls game, and that is a Khajiit. They hail from the province of Elsewhere, and yes, that's how it's pronounced, but they are a feline race, and their actual physical form is dependent on the position of the twin moons Maser and Secunda upon their birth. So when they're born, they all kind of look similar, but then once they grow up, they kind of have different ways that they look. Some look a little bit more feline, some look a little bit more humanoid, some are bipedal, and some are actually walk on all fours. Some look like these really big saber cats, and some actually look like little house cats. So there's a lot of variety just depending on how the moons are positioned. And you can only play as like one type, which is a bipedal form with like a humanoid body and like a feline face with fur and ears and a tail. But there's actually far more forms than that. And I hope maybe in future games we can get some other Khajiit forms to play with, because I think that would be really interesting, at least to see.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool, especially since, then assuming all of the Khajiit have their appearance depending on when they were born, well, I guess we can only play Khajiit that are born during a certain position of those moons, so...
Yeah, exactly. And they're, since they're cats, they're obviously very agile and very intelligent, so... They're another excellent choice if you want to be a sneak archer, or they actually make a really good thief or assassin. So depending on which way you want to go, that's definitely pretty good for them.
Interesting. Now, when I play Skyrim, I've noticed that the Khajiit tend to have their own little camps outside of larger cities. And so to me, my impression is that the human races are, it almost seems like they're racist against the Khajiit, but maybe it's the other way around, is that like the Khajiit prefer to be secluded to themselves. I'm not really sure. Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's definitely the case of the Khajiit experiencing discrimination, because most of them are not allowed in the cities, so they have to camp outside there. Around in Skyrim, they're mainly merchants, so they kind of travel along the different roads, and they'll buy and sell, and you can just get all kinds of goods from them, or you can sell off some of your the unwanted gear that you don't need to them. They're usually pretty nice, but unfortunately there's just a lot of discrimination that they face, being that they are a beast race. Actually both of the beast races kind of experience a lot of discrimination because of that. I guess because they see them as kind of part animal, that they aren't really equal, maybe. I don't know, but it is kind of sad to see that most of them can't even go into the city.
Yeah, it is sad, but it also shows kind of that level of complexity that the creators of these games went into to the lore of everything. It's like, they thought about how these races would interact with each other ahead of time, and created that in the world as you're playing the game. So that's cool. It adds like a level of depth. Also, a little quick story about my most recent experience in Skyrim. I was just kind of wandering along once and was like, okay, so I'm going to play the game, blah, blah, blah. And I came across a Khajiit who said, hey, you want to increase your sneak skills? You can practice with me. And I'm like, okay, sure. You're going to like have me do some, drills or something like that. I accidentally like paid to increase my sneak ability.
That's one of the awesome things about Skyrim is there's different trainers that you can go to, and depending on what you want to train in, you can pay them a certain amount of gold. And there are different levels of trainers, so once you reach a certain level, some of the more basic trainers you can't really use anymore. But I've always thought that was pretty neat that as long as you had the gold, you could kind of pay to level up your skills in somewhat. So
Yeah, that is kind of cool.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of a cheat, but you do actually have to earn the gold that you spend. So not really a cheat, I don't think.
Yeah, it's kind of like real life.
Yeah, exactly. And going back for just a second, when you said we're talking about how different races interact with each other, specifically in Skyrim, in one of the cities, you'll notice that the Dunmer are only in one certain part of the city, and that's because that's pretty much, the only part that they were allowed or given. And then the Argonians are actually outside that city in one little kind of area on the docks, because that's, again, all the area that they were allowed and given. So you kind of do, get to see that active kind of discrimination and the, just the interaction between the different races in Skyrim. It just adds to the depth, I think.
Yeah.
Of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does. And so now with the last race is, you said the Argonians, right?
Yep, and I just mentioned them. They are from Blackmarsh, and they are a lizard race who is actually dependent on the Hist, which is a species of giant spore trees that are said to be sentient and possibly the most ancient race in Tamriel. The young Argonians are actually fed Hist sap once they hatch from their eggs, and the Hist sap can give them different abilities depending on what the Hist thinks that they need. For instance, the Hist foresaw the Oblivion invasion, and so they kind of fed the little hatchlings the Hist sap that was basically kind of like the super soldier serum, so that when the Oblivion gates actually opened in Blackmarsh, the Argonians actually charged into Oblivion. And they beat back the Daedra so soundly that the Daedra commanders were actually forced to close the Oblivion gates there. So that kind of gives you an idea as to their fierceness and ferocity on the battlefield.
That's really cool, actually. And that's kind of cool a little bit about the Hist tree, too. I've always been a fan of I forget what they're called, but in Lord of the Rings, the big tree people. I've been a fan of those guys. So it kind of makes me think of them because they're very wise. And, that can also kind of have a little bit of foresight and, what's the word? It gives them a little bit of intuition about coming events and things, so.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even though they don't, talk and move, I think they still, somehow sense different things going on in the world, and so they kind of, work to prepare the Argonians because, obviously since they can't move and fight for themselves, the Argonians have to fight for them. So that's how they kind of survive, even to this day.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
Yeah. And now the Argonians are pretty agile and quick, and they can make good sneak archers, but they're also a pretty good choice for just a straight-up warrior. They're kind of pretty well balanced in that way. So I really like using them actually just as straight-up warriors because I think there's just nothing more terrifying than seeing this brightly colored lizard just bearing down on you with this big old weapon.
Nice, that's awesome. Plus, you probably don't need to have as heavy of armor because this lizard's scaly skin is probably pretty sturdy.
Oh, yeah, probably. It doesn't really reflect in-game, but I mean, for role-playing wise, it probably does. Interesting factoid, one of the things of the Elder Scrolls game is you can actually, instead of using weapons or magic, you can actually use hand-to-hand combat, no matter what race you are. But if you use hand-to-hand combat as a Khajiit or as an Argonian, you actually get a natural boost because of your claws.
Oh, that is really awesome. I did not know that.
Yeah, but you get more damage.
That's awesome. I knew that you could do hand-to-hand. I just didn't realize that, depending on the race you had... Well, that makes sense, of course, but depending on the race, you get different bonuses, based on actual physical features.
Oh yeah, there is actually a really specific and kind of fun build called a Punch Cat, because Khajiit actually has the most damage with their claws, and it's basically just this heavy armored cat with these, heavy armored gauntlets coming around and just punching everything. And there are actually, in Skyrim at least, there are actually kill scenes for, if you kill someone with being unarmed.
That's awesome. Yeah, I also really love in Skyrim how there's, if you make a really cool kill, they do like a slow motion, I guess, play of the attack as you're doing it. I'm like, oh yeah.
Yeah, like a kill cam.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there's special ones, depending on what weapon or playstyle you use. So, like if you're burning somebody, obviously it looks different than if you have, if you're wielding two swords or if you have a big battle axe, or if you're, going at it hand to hand, you could suplex them or slam them to the ground, and they, that's your kill cam. So it's
a wealth of possibilities.
Yes. And now, since we've covered the different races, now we can kind of get into the games themselves. Now there are some mobile games, and there are expansions and separate games that were released, like Redguard and Battlespire, and games like that. But I'm just going to go with the main continuity of games as they were released. Now, the first Elder Scrolls game was Arena. That was released back in 1994 on the DOS operating system. So, a little bit of a throwback. And if any of you were listening to the Jeopardy episode, you might have caught this little factoid about Arena. But Arena actually takes place across the entire continent of Tamriel. It's one of the only two games that actually takes place across all of Tamriel, the other one being Elder Scrolls Online. And this game follows the player character as they seek to release the Emperor Uriel Septim VII, who has been imprisoned in another dimension while the Imperial battle mage Jagger Tharn impersonates him. So the player is directed to gather these certain artifacts in order to assemble the pieces of the Staff of Chaos, and then they have to go fight Jagger Tharn in the Imperial City and rescue the Emperor. So kind of a big deal in the storyline.
I can understand why it's called Arena.
Yeah, because there's so many battles that you have to go through just to get all these different pieces. And the playable races in this one, they actually did not include the Imperial or the Orcs. So you can only play as a Nord, Redguard, Breton for the human races. For the elves, you can only play as an Altmer, Dunmer, or Bosmer. And then you can play as either beast race. So they, for whatever reason, just didn't include the Imperials or the Orcs. And I'm not really sure why, but yeah.
Okay.
And then the next game is Daggerfall. That was released in 1996, again for the DOS operating system. That takes place in various areas of High Rock and Hammerfell, so around where the Bretons and the Redguards are. And that follows the player character as they attempt to ascertain the location of the Mantella, which will resurrect a powerful brass golem known as Numidium. Now, there are several different possible endings to the game, depending on what the player does with the different artifacts. So I'm not going to go into really any of them and spoil them for anybody.
That's really cool.
Yeah, like so depending on your decisions and your choices, you can, kind of similar to Fallout New Vegas, it, unlocks different endings, but then it also, locks certain things from you as you go along. So I think it's pretty neat.
That is cool. It's like a true choose-your-own adventure.
Exactly. And the playable races for that is the same as Arena, so no Imperials or Orcs, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Now the next game is Morrowind, and that was released in 2002 for Windows and the original Xbox. So this was the first game to actually be available on a console as opposed to just a computer. And this takes place, as you can probably guess, in Morrowind, specifically in the inner island of Vardenfell. The whole province of Morrowind, it's kind of like on the outer edge of Tamriel, and part of it is kind of like a crescent on the main continent of Tamriel. And then there is there's an island kind of just off of that crescent, and that's Vardenfell. And so that's actually where the game Morrowind takes place. And this particular game follows the player character as they uncover and fulfill the prophecies that confirm that they're the Nerevarine, which is the reincarnation of the Dunmer legendary hero Indoril Nerevar. And they do this in order to unite the Dunmer to defeat the deity Dagath-ur. And this, I think I mentioned, was the first game to make all the non-extinct races of Tamriel available for play. So if you were just waiting to play as a Imperial or an Orc, well, this was your game to play.
Nice. Now, I didn't know about Morrowind. Or the first Elder Scrolls game I knew about was the next one you're going to talk about, Oblivion. And I didn't know about Morrowind until later on. And now, right now, is the first time I've heard about Daggerfall. And I think you had mentioned Arena in one of our other conversations. So it's kind of interesting how certain games are popular at certain times when you get into it. But, you look into the background of Elder Scrolls or any other, franchise of games or movies or anything, and there's a lot more than what you expect.
Oh yeah, and I mean I'm still just covering the bare bones here, just spoiler free and everything like that. So I mean there's tons and tons of backstory that we can dig up and talk about all day long. And speaking of lore, the next game was another particularly popular game, still even today. And that was Oblivion. This was released in 2006 for Windows and Xbox 360, and in 2007 it was released for PS3, so it was the first Elder Scrolls game to be available on a Sony system. This takes place in the province of Cyrodiil, and it follows the player character as they become the hero of Kvatch and eventually the champion of Cyrodiil by helping the last surviving Septim heir, Martin, defeat the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon and stop the invasion from his plane of oblivion. So it's a lot of action, and I think a lot of people like this game, particularly because even though, you are a major player in the events, you actually aren't the real hero himself. The real hero is Martin Septim, and you're basically just along for the ride, and you're there to help, assist him and help whatever he needs you to do.
That's awesome, yeah. And I have played the beginning of Oblivion maybe a couple of times, and I have yet to actually get very far in the game. But playing the beginning of it, I think it's in Oblivion, but it could be Skyrim instead that I'm remembering. But the Emperor at the beginning of the game, is that in Oblivion or is it in Skyrim?
If you're talking about the one voiced by our dear Captain Jean-Luc Picard,
yes.
that is the one in Oblivion, yes.
Yes, okay, I was remembering correctly. Yes, I was going to say, give a listen to that voice of the Emperor, because he may sound familiar to some of us nerds, whether you're Marvel fans or Star Trek fans, X-Men fans in the Marvel world. But, our beloved Jean-Luc Picard, or
Professor X.
Professor X, yes. I was going to say, because I just watched X-Men, the first one, the other day. And I'm like, why am I forgetting? Yeah. But actually, what's cool right now is my husband and a couple of friends and I are doing it's been a while since we've played, but we're doing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign based on the Oblivion storyline. So my husband is the DM for this, and me and two of our friends are playing as different characters. And so it's been kind of fun and interesting to play it from a different perspective and do more of an imagination instead of seeing the world laid out in front of you. It's kind of cool.
Oh yeah, that sounds like it'd be really interesting, because the story itself is just really cool, how everything comes together, and how as opposed to being like the one, big hero out in front. You're just kind of assisting. I mean, you're still a hero in your own right, but still, you're not like the hero at the end of the day. You're just kind of there.
Yeah, like a major supporting character.
Exactly. And then not the last game, but the most recent. The most recent single player game, we'll say. That was released that is Skyrim, of course, and that was released in 2011 for Windows, Xbox 360, and PS3. It was re-released in 2016 as a special edition on PS4 and Xbox One, and it was also released in 2017 for Nintendo Switch and PlayStation VR.
Nice.
So yeah, we got a lot of different platforms that it's available on.
Yeah.
And if you have it on Xbox One or PS4, it does have mod support. Although the PS4 is very limited because Sony does not allow external assets to be used for their mods. So unfortunately, those mods are very, very limited. But it is interesting to at least see mod support on a console for once.
That would be, yeah.
Yeah, and it actually, I've tried them out, and they actually pretty much work for the most part, at least the ones that I've tried. So, especially if you have an Xbox One, I definitely recommend to give it a whirl. And as, you can kind of ascertain from the title, it takes place in Skyrim. Although the Dragonborn DLC does add the island of Solstheim, which is just off the coast of Skyrim. And Solstheim is actually an island that was a part of Skyrim, but it was given to the Dunmer to kind of as a refuge for when the Red Mountain erupted. And that was, obviously a huge crisis that a lot of Dunmer had to leave their homeland for. And so they kind of inhabited part of the island of Solstheim as a part of that. So you get to visit Solstheim in the Dragonborn DLC. And you actually previously visited it in the expansion for Morrowind called Blood Moon. So if you played Morrowind and you haven't played Skyrim yet, you do get to go to a familiar place there. And this particular game follows the player character as they learn that they're the fabled last Dragonborn who must defeat the dragon Alduin the World Eater before he destroys the world. This game people do kind of criticize a little bit because they say it's a little bit dumbed down. All the previous games, along with the races, they also had a class system, and they had like birth signs and everything like that. So, depending on what you chose, you did have to kind of limit yourself in your play style. Whereas in Skyrim, you could really be a jack of all trades and you could do anything and everything. So, I mean, and some people don't really like that, but I mean, I think it personally kind of opens it up to other people who maybe wouldn't play a stricter RPG, but who might be more interested in playing something where they could kind of experiment and kind of feel around and then settle in and, enjoy the game.
Yeah, no, I think that is cool too. And Skyrim is probably the one I've played the most, although again, I haven't gotten very far. And that's the one I'm playing as a Redguard, but I'm playing as an archer, which is kind of interesting because, typically a Redguard would be more of a fighter type character, I suppose. But I do really like that Skyrim allows you to choose your own specialties as you go through. And so, as you achieve different things, you can level up in different areas and you can pick whatever you want to. And it's really, really cool. Especially to me, I consider myself kind of a novice RPG gamer. So I like that, because I can just kind of do what I want. And then once I figure out what I want more, then I can do something that's more specific.
Exactly. So, I mean, if you're like a novice player or you're just starting out with RPGs, Skyrim is definitely one of the best games out of all of these to go for, because you will get to play around, a little bit with that and kind of figure out what you like and what you don't like before you kind of, are forced to lock it in with like a class or anything like that. Skyrim was actually the very first Elder Scrolls game I played. And then I went back and played Oblivion. And I highly recommend, if you can, once you kind of get used to it, to go back and play the older games if you can, because, a lot of these, even if the graphics aren't as good, I mean, the stories are great, and the characters that get to talk to and interact with, you can see maybe referenced in other ways in the different games. So it's kind of neat, to go back to older games and see this person and like, oh, I read about you in a book, or, oh, I, saw your skeleton at some place,
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Especially for me personally, I love backstory, and so starting out playing with, I started a little bit of Oblivion and have yet to finish that, and I've started Skyrim a little bit as well. So, I'm kind of playing those simultaneously, I suppose. Although I don't know if I can play Oblivion on our current console, because we have an Xbox One, not a 360. But
yes, you can, because I have Oblivion on Xbox One, so it is backwards compatible.
Yay! Okay, so I know I can. That's great. But like going back to the earlier games would be super cool to me, because it's all like backstory at that point. You get to experience some of the events that maybe formed up what's happening in the newer games. So that's cool. Oh
yeah, definitely. And that's actually an interesting thing that is happening with the actual most recent game with Elder Scrolls Online. It's a little bit different because it's an MMO RPG and not just a single player RPG.
In case you're not a huge gamer, sorry to interject. In case you're not a huge gamer, MMORPG means massive multiplayer online role playing game. So that's why it's shortened.
Yeah. So just so we don't have to spout that mouthful every single time. But, I mean, obviously, since there's different factions fighting and, they can be doing different things and maybe triumphing in different ways at any different times, what they do lore-wise, they say that anything that happens in Elder Scrolls Online is technically canon. But it covers a period that is what's called a dragon break, which is a very unique period in time in which basically any and all outcomes exist at the same time.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really weird. I can't imagine living through something like that. But nope. Yeah, that's kind of how they reconcile, maybe different factions triumphing at different times, with the actual lore of maybe what happened after. Because Elder Scrolls Online is actually the first game to go back in time. Each of these games typically are going forward in time, but this is the first that actually goes back in time. This actually goes back before the events of Morrowind. So this is kind of nestled, I believe, in the second era, and Morrowind takes place in the third era. So that's how they kind of reconcile all these different events going on at the same time. But it's still really cool. The basic storyline is that, for at least the base game, is that the infamous necromancer Manny Marco, the King of Worms, has to be defeated, and so basically you just have to fight him, and his hordes of armies. Now, there is one version of the game that you buy where you can play as any race in any faction. But unless you buy that version, the race that you choose will actually determine the faction that you go to. There's 3 main factions. That's the Aldmeri Dominion, which is comprised of the Altmer, Bosmer, and Khajiit. There's the Daggerfall Covenant, which is a bunch of Bretons, Redguards, and Orsimer. And then there's the Ebonheart Pact, which is the faction that my main character is in. And they're made up of the Nords, Dunmer, and Argonians.
Nice. Let me guess you're an Argonian.
Nope, actually I'm a Dunmer. I have
really?
a character who is a Dunmer Dragon Knight, and she uses fire whips, and she dual wields swords, and she's just a generally really cool character.
Nice. That sounds awesome.
Oh yeah, so that's kind of just a base overview of the world itself, the races, where they're from, and kind of each game itself. And, I hope, listening to this has kind of motivated anyone, if they haven't picked up one of these games yet, to kind of, maybe pick them up and give them a try. Because I guarantee you, once you start, you probably won't be able to stop, just like me.
It's kind of true. Right now, like, I'm itching to get some Skyrim going here. I'm like, ooh, I kind of want to go play it right now.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so awesome. Well, thanks for getting nerdy with us, everybody. Make sure you talk nerdy to us. If you have played any of these games, tell us which one your favorite game was. What was your favorite Elder Scrolls game, if you can pick? You can find Beauties and Headcanons on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr. And also, go ahead and share your nerdy topic suggestions, because we'd love to make episodes specific to what you guys want to hear about. Subscribe to this podcast and to others from Public House Media on iTunes, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and wherever else good podcasts can be found. We love feedback as well, so if you liked this episode, or even if you didn't, give us a rating and a review on our Facebook page or on our iTunes, or wherever you can give us a rating, so that we can keep making great episodes for you. I'm Emily.
And I'm Elisabeth.
Thanks for getting nerdy with us on Beauties and Headcanons.